When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
By playing lead guitar, does that mean you're sort of leader of the group, or are you?
No, just... Well, you see, the other guitars, the rhythm, ting, 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 you see.
It's solo guitar, you see. John is, in fact, the leader of the group.
Yeah. Do you have any acknowledged leader of the group?
No, not really.
And this was one of the main faults of John and Paul. They were so busy being John and Paul, they failed to realize who else was around at the time.
Welcome to episode 215 of Something About the Beatles. This one is titled Four Sides of the Square, and it comes from that Paul McCartney quote some of you may be familiar with. I always say the Beatles is like four sides of a square. Without any side, the square collapses, and we were very much four elements that had to be in that group. So what we're going to do is dissect that a bit on this show with my guest today, Dr. Duncan Driver, returning guest and also a terrific guest at Fab4Con Jam, the first of which held in February 2021 this year, but certainly not the last. And so what is meant by that? There he's speaking to the essential qualities each member brought to the band that made the Beatles what they were. So he's being very egalitarian there, although in other instances, one can make the case everyone's equal, some are more equal than others, to quote Orwell. And really, there's a couple different threads to this discussion today. One is the four different elements that made the Beatles what they were, the success they were in different arenas. And this was Duncan's own thesis. The Beatles as a performing act, which arguably was the most egalitarian of them. And to that end, that's why you heard that BBC recording early on in the EMI years that the Beatles did that's reflective of their stage act, a song that they also were caught on tape performing at the Star Club when George was doing a lot more lead vocals and the band were really very well integrated before there was the beginning of the power shifts that occurred. So that's one element of the four that Duncan came up with. Another being John and Paul as composers, which certainly affected the balance of power in the band. There is the Beatles as singles artists and the Beatles as album artists. So those are the four elements we discussed. But really, this is sort of drilling down into the balance of power within the band and not one of these stupid, superficial discussions of who's better, John or Paul, or were the Beatles really as essential to the band as a lot of us fans think, and as Paul is certainly expressing there. Or was it more, as John would say, very late in his life, the Beatles were me and Paul, whether George and Ringo were there was irrelevant because Paul and I made the music. And he's also caught on tape saying something similar in January 1969, one of the Niagara reels where he's saying basically that he could be the Beatles with three other guys. Paul could be the Beatles, but George or Ringo couldn't be the Beatles playing with other people. So it seems to be a pretty consistent take he had on what was Beatles and what wasn't. In any event, my discussion with Duncan Driver, we cover a lot of ground and explore both of these separate threads of investigation here. Duncan, of course, in addition to being heard on this show and being part of Fab4Con Jam, can also be heard on Diana Erickson's podcast, One Sweet Dream, as a regular or semi-regular guest these days. Google around. You should check out her show. Check out Another Kind of Mind podcast. She and Duncan had a panel actually together at Fab4Con Jam, which you'll be able to access again sometime soon. I should also say, another big announcement coming as far as Fab Four Con Jam goes and its future and this year and other big things to talk about. Anyway, that's a conversation for another day. Watch this space on social media. We began our conversation on the discussion of leadership, and it was something that came up at various points, especially early on in the Beatles' career when people would ask them and making small talk with the Beatles before they were a known thing. So who's the leader of the group? And it's something that apparently in the minds of some Beatles more than others through the years was of great importance. Who was the leader?
That question of leadership is actually probably a good one to spend a minute on, because it's a way into what I wanted to talk about. When I first got in touch with you with a suggestion for the way a second conversation between us could play out, it was around this idea of Paul's claim that there was no real leader to the Beatles. It wasn't the case that John Lennon was 3/4 of the Beatles, or that Paul McCartney was 3/4 of the Beatles, but he likes this idea of four sides of a square, this very democratic, equal way of playing things out. And I've heard other people talk about that. Sam Wiles likes to say, if this is four sides of a square, it's a very lopsided square. I think he jokingly refers to it as the four-sided rhombus. The way I might phrase it is by adapting a line from Orwell's Animal Farm and say, all Beatles are equal, but some Beatles seem to be more equal than others, at least some of the time.
I think that is absolutely true.
Yeah.
And I think it was maybe sort of essential to their dynamic was that everybody contributed to the greater whole without question. But in terms of George's line about Beatles second class, or however he expressed it, some more equal than others, I think it functioned simply because the two that you might regard in the hierarchy as further down knew their place. And maybe John and Paul undervalued George's contribution and never saw him as an equal because he didn't have that aggressive, elbowing people aside personality. He did tend to lay back, but would assert the creativity he felt toward whatever they were doing. If he had a good musical idea, he wasn't going to hold it back, but he didn't have to have his mug out in front either. And that made him perfect.
Do you think that he would have wanted to be more of an equal partner, less Lennon-McCartney, more Lennon-McCartney-Harrison, or did he respect the specialness of that dyad as something he wasn't trying to encroach into?
I think mostly, this is my perception, and perhaps if I wanted to make this a thesis, I could dig up exact examples and instances that support it. But my perception from all the history I've studied is that more than anything, he wanted to be seen as artistically valid and not just suffered. Not just, okay, George, what have you got now for us? And I think that as much as he found, for whatever reason, it easier to work with John. Now, as I played in a recent show, that interview clip where he talks about, from 1974, Paul McCartney ruining him as a guitar player, meaning that he felt so diminished in confidence that he didn't know if he was good or bad. But absent Paul in the equation, such as his work on the Imagine album, he plays with complete confidence.
Yeah.
You know, it's some stunning work. And at the same time, at some point, he must have come to the recognition that John only ever saw him as a useful tool in the toolbox and not somebody that he could regard and respect his artistry as.
Yeah, it reminds me of that line from, I think it's Not Guilty. I'm not trying to upset the apple cart. I only want what I can get. There's a haunting phrase from George. I think it's in that confrontation between John and George in 1974, where George keeps repeating, I did everything you asked of me. I did everything you wanted me to do. And it seems to imply, and you're still not willing to meet me on equal terms, or something like that.
Right. And so whether he aspired to being a true Paul McCartney type collaborator with John, or he simply wanted John to respect his artistry and take it seriously, I think it may be overstated, the whole thing about John tending not to show up when they were recording Georgia songs in the last half of the Beatles' career. I think that may be a little bit overstated. You know, John tried to defend himself saying, well, you didn't need us. You had somebody like Eric around. Well, that was one song. and he certainly wasn't particularly needed on the Indian stuff. But he contributed in his way to different things. He's on Old Brown Shoe. His guitar part got wiped, but the vocal's still there. He's on Something. He plays the piano on that. He plays the solo on For You Blue. He contributed the animal noises to Piggies. He's not on everything, but he's not absent on everything either. I'm not sure if George really wanted to write with John, have that kind of relationship as he did with Paul, where they can sort of contribute to each other's things. John, I'm stuck here. Can you help me with that? I mean, we saw in 1980 in the Playboy interview how he reacts to that, being asked to help him with Taxman. And he said, had to bite my tongue and roll my eyes. Now I got to help you. And George must have picked up on that because it seemed like as much as he would have liked to have had that given freely from John, he never did. And I think it had to have been hurtful on some level that brought him to the point he was in 1974. It's like, I've given and given and given, and what have I gotten back from you?
Yeah. There's a question I wanted to ask you about the nature of leadership in the Beatles. And it was from one of their relatively early press conferences where an interviewer asks Paul, is John the boss of the Beatles? Would you agree with that? And Paul says, I don't know really. On some things he is, and some things he isn't. But there's no real leader anyway. It depends who shouts the loudest. If Paul is right to say on some things, John is the leader, what are the things he's referring to?
If you look creatively, and John is like unmistakably and undeniably dominant in their first few years, tending to get not every, but the majority of the lead vocals on their opening tracks, their closing tracks on their albums, dominant on their singles. You know, he's the one that pens the two movie themes. I think that John very much jockeyed for that feeling this competition with Paul, he wanted to make sure it was him. And I think that Paul didn't fight him too hard if John came up with the goods. And certainly Paul was there to facilitate the development of this stuff. If John comes up with Help, it's Paul that comes up with the counter melody and helps make that song into this great, dynamic, compelling record that it is, singing the high bridge and Hard Day's Night. If John's got something great, he's not looking to sabotage him, as John would claim later, getting all experimental and sabotaging my great songs. I think he absolutely, from beginning to the end, wanted to make what John brought to the group that much better.
Yeah.
But as far as John leads in some things and not in others, I think that John certainly was much more driven and ambitious in the Beatles in the earlier years than he was later, to the point where in March of 66, he's telling Maureen Cleave, whatever I'm meant to do, this isn't it. And that's about the point where you see him sort of taking a step back. He's immersing himself in acid. And I've always seen Revolver as sort of the midpoint where the torch is being passed. And suddenly from that point on, it's Paul that's driving them in terms of what the next project is and all that stuff. There is a very early interview, I think from 62, maybe it's the first one that we have from October 62, upon the release of Love Me Do, where I think the interviewer asks them who's the leader, and they all go John.
Yeah.
Because that was the dynamic as I saw it back then. And so the answer that you're given, which clearly was a bit later, and when he speaks to you, he's a leader in some things and not other things, seems to ring a lot more true. And just from an observational point of view, think that Paul was canny enough to, in situations where there was a decision needing to be made or something, let John think it's his idea. But ultimately, things would go the way he'd wanted them. He knew not to butt heads, a direct confrontation. But I think he knew how to finesse making John think that a Paul idea was his idea. Have you ever picked up on that?
Yeah, I can see that. Another way I like to think about it is that if John's a leader, he's fairly unconventional in the way that he approaches leadership, and that there's contradictions involved. Like in when they do a press conference in Sydney, in Australia in 1964, one of the press says, "Do you have an acknowledged leader of the group?" And John has this brilliant response. He stands up as if to claim leadership and says, "No, not really." I like the contradiction between the action and what he's saying, and that seems to me sort of representative of his approach. Like sometimes he puts himself forward, composing the lead songs for their films, or when Brian sweeps in and says, "We are to represent Britain in this big satellite link-up," it's John's.
Yeah.
That is the one. Maybe that's one of the sort of final instances of John pushing himself or his material forward. But sometimes he gets pushed forward as well, and there's as much reluctance to accept the responsibilities of leadership thrust on him as him sort of seizing the reins or wanting to be the leader of a gang. There's a nice anecdote that I think Mark Lewison talks about it in Tune In when they're recording How Do You Do It? And one of the Beatles ends up having a conversation with George Martin about the fact that they don't want this to be a single. And Lewison says, this was likely to have been John Lennon. And that's backed up, I think, in a Lennon Remembers quote, where he says, when the dirty work came, I had to be the leader. Whatever the scene was, when it came to the nitty-gritty, I had to do the speaking. So that suggests that leadership is a kind of an irksome task that others make him do.
It's funny, as I was thinking of that very quote, which of course came when he was describing leaving the Maharishi.
Yeah.
And yeah, it absolutely fits the how do you do it scenario. And we weren't there, nor was Lewison. It does seem to have a ring of truth about it based on his personality as we've come to understand it, as somebody that was not afraid of a confrontation. Although John himself has tempered that in interviews, saying he acted like a Ted, but if a real Ted called him out on a fight, I'd be shit scared. It's like he knew he wasn't the tough guy he projected. But that just circles back to Paul's thing about whoever was the loudest. And John tended to be the loudest, whether it was effective or not. That tended to be the way I think that he intuited winning something, bringing it his way. And maybe the little victories he had like that were not things that the others cared so much about or went along with anyway.
Yeah. Diana Erickson, who hosts One Sweet Dream, drew my attention to another curious phrase of John's about leadership, where I think it's in 69, he talks about how he wishes the others would let him lead. And the use of the word let is really interesting. And it seems like you want to respond to John. One of the qualities of leadership is that you inspire others to follow, like to have to turn around and beg for leadership suggests maybe you're not naturally inclined towards it.
That's really interesting. That was in a 69 interview?
I think so. I'm sorry, I don't have the source to hand.
That's funny. Because my impression is, going back to 66, where he's sort of withdrawing, he has a bunch of songs ready to record for Revolver right away, and that's the first things they tackle. And then midway through the sessions, he's kind of spent, so much so that to fill that space, George gets a third track because he's got the material ready, and they accept it. And then George has to help him cobble together what ends up being She Said, the final track. But then you've got Paul flat out leading the way with Pepper. That's his baby, his concept, to a degree that there is a concept other than just hiding behind this alter ego. And therein implicitly giving you latitude to make music that's not necessarily within the Beatles paradigm.
Yeah.
And if you look at the songs John does on Pepper, and this is not to take anything away from whatever he contributed to that album, it seems like you've gone from a guy that was writing songs to write songs in the first couple of years of the band. Then he starts smoking weed, he starts listening to the influence of Dylan, starts expressing his inner life, and that reaches full flower with his songs on Rubber Soul, Girl and Nowhere Man, In My Life and Norwegian Wood. And then come Revolver, he's smitten with acid, and everything he writes has got some sort of basis of being informed by that experience. And come Pepper, it's not so much inner life or acid that is his channel to creativity. It's Julian Lennon's painting from school, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, that gives him an excuse to enact his Lewis Carroll fantasies. Randomly, on a video shoot, he finds an Antique Circus poster. Well, that becomes a song. What's that? There's a Kellogg's Cornflakes commercial on in the background. Oh, good morning, good morning. He looks in the paper. They've got the coroner's inquest for the Guinness heir, Tara Brown, who's killed a month before. That becomes the first verse of A Day in the Life, which Paul contributes mightily to, but it's still, I think, to most fans, considered a John song, even though the lick, I'd Love to Turn You On, and a lot of the way that song is put together came from Paul. So I think that if you look at those sources of inspiration in 67 for what's their most highly acclaimed album, it's sort of a departure from the stuff that he normally puts into his work that he's best known for, which is stuff speaking to his personal experiences. It's almost like work on demand. Okay, what's in front of me? I got to crank out some songs. I think they said as much. It's like Paul had this habit of, well, let's go in the studio, guys. I've got my 10 songs written. because he's just this powerhouse of creativity at that time.
Yeah, I think sometimes that because Yoko exacerbated John's autobiographical songwriting with this idea that the artist is the art, he ended up becoming very dismissive of a whole side to his art or his craft or whatever you want to call it, that I think is equally valuable. Some of my favorite Lennon songs, the most melodic, and that they can have a third person perspective. And I don't think that ever really went away. I think he maybe didn't trust it as much. He seemed to think that was inauthentic, or writing songs to order, churning them out. I find some of those Lennon songs really intriguing, including the demos for things like Sally and Billy or Tennessee that never really saw the light of day. These are really interesting songs.
It's interesting that he was moved to write that sort of stuff, that he was so dismissive of Paul, boring people doing boring things, which is his shorthand for anything that didn't come directly from my own experience. But he's the guy that was so invested in wordplay from single-digit age, and he starts doing the Daily Howl, and he does all this writing that becomes the basis of 2 of his books. Once he starts incorporating that into Beatle lyrics, I think as a record, this is my own opinion, I think Lucy in the Sky is a great record, but with a weaker lyric than he normally trafficked in. I'm not putting all the blame on him. I think that Paul contributed to it. I thought some of it was just a little random, but when he was putting together phrases that, even if they didn't have a literal meaning, at least scanned well and were poetic and resonant. I'm thinking of things like I'm the Walrus for sure, but also something that he didn't take very seriously, Cry Baby Cry, I think is a lovely song.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's another thing that, in addition to, yes, as you say, Yoko sort of pushed him into this, if it's not about me personally, then it's inauthentic or it's not worth anything. He could do that. He could channel his inner life, and that's great. But he also had this side where he was so much of a great craftsman with words. I mean, maybe the best example of all is Across the Universe.
Yeah, and he certainly had, that's one of the sticking point songs in the Lennon-McCartney relationship, isn't it? That's a bone of contention for John, feeling like it was never fully realized, or Paul didn't like it enough, didn't recognize its greatness.
Yeah, I'm singing out of tune, and nobody's supporting me.
That's right. Yeah, I suppose the spur for wanting to have this conversation was this idea of Paul's that there are 4 sides to the square of the Beatles dynamic. And my knee-jerk response to that was a bit like Sam Wiles. It's a very lopsided square, if that's the case.
Right.
Sometimes that's true. It is very democratic and equal. Like when the band are breaking up, Paul would draw attention to the fact that they always had a get-out-of-jail clause. Any of them were free to leave at any point, and that's all I'm trying to do. And no project would go ahead unless all 4 of them wanted to do it. But there seem to be other instances that problematize just how equal this really was. I remember George Martin talking about how when they were making the choice of what song would be chosen as a single, it would be a vote, but the majority would rule. It wasn't the case that every single band member had to agree, and George Martin got a vote as well. I'm interested in dynamics of how authentic this 4 side of a square analogy is. And it occurred to me that that's a way to look at the dynamics of power within the Beatles, or creativity, if you like. But it might also serve as a way of thinking about the fact that the Beatles had distinctly different identities. I think that's one of the things that's most fascinating and impressive about them. I mean, every time August the 22nd rolls around, somebody on social media will post the first photo ever taken of the Beatles as a group with Ringo in it, and then the last one. And the symmetry, the sort of felicity of the fact that these were both taken on August the 22nd, 7 years apart. And when you think about what gets squeezed into those 7 years, maybe the first thing that leaps to mind is these brilliant albums that they made. You can see the sort of covers of them floating in your imagination over the course of 7 years. But it's not all there is to the Beatles' creativity or story. Yes, they are a great album act or band, whatever you want to call it. But they're also this live band, and they started as a live band. They're also, if you want to think of them as recording artists, then it's almost like they have parallel recording careers, because they're making albums from early 1963, but they're just as invested, in some ways more invested, in the 45 single market.
Mm-hmm.
They think of that as quite a distinctly different thing. And I suppose if I'm trying to think of this in terms of four elements to their identity, you might say the Beatles as film artists is the fourth element. But I'm more tempted to say that Lennon-McCartney as a songwriting duo or marriage or partnership, as something that exists at the very core of the Beatles and is somehow distinct in and of itself, might be the fourth element. Do you think that this idea has any legs?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a great way of sort of demarcating the different facets of this band that were all paramount importance at different times. As you point out, the performing artist, the musical live act, that really was what put them on the map. It got them a reputation. We're all familiar with how they weren't too highly regarded in Liverpool. Suddenly they get, by luck, sent to Hamburg. That is the making of them, as they all said all along. So much so that despite everything that followed once they got the EMI recording contract, John is like, our best music was never recorded.
Yeah.
There was nobody could touch us in England when we were on stage, this great band. And thank God we've got the Star Club tapes to at least have a glimmer of that. And that was recorded under these conditions. Love Me Do was out. Please Please Me with in the can. They did not want to be there. They were fulfilling a contractual obligation. And yet for most of that material, they're on fire. It's just amazing, the punch and the electricity you feel, minus the visual of what those people witnessed in that club in 1962. You can understand how the hardest audience in the world, they worked until they were able to have them in the palm of their hand. And after that, apparently everything seemed easy.
Yeah, it's tempting because the Lennon-McCartney songbook and the Beatles records still sound so fresh and so vital, and that's the kind of standard that you judge the Beatles by, to think that that must always have been of paramount importance to them. But I found reading Tune In that a revelatory argument that Mark Lewisohn makes is that songwriting is not that important to the Beatles until much later than you'd think it was. And what's driving them, as you say, is their live act. And if they're writing songs, I mean, clearly they're interested in writing hit songs, but it's something that they're doing in between their touring commitments. And that's the engine that's driving the Beatles. And in the really early days, I don't know about you, but when I listen to Please Please Me, the album, not the single, what I hear is a document of their live performance. I mean, Paul counts it in like it's the start of their show. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then at the end, Twist and Shout. It's like that big final encore number, and you can almost see the unison bows and the curtain closing at the end, and they can't sing anymore because John's voice is torn and they're just sort of spent in terms of energy.
Yeah.
It sounds like a live act, doesn't it?
Yeah, in its way. It's their first concept album.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know George Martin toyed with the idea of recording it in the cavern, and I think that that's further evidence to this idea that that album, at least, is a document of the Beatles as a live performing act or band.
It is interesting that we know that they did, by the time EMI signed them, they had a great reputation as a live act. They absolutely did, whether in Hamburg or in Liverpool. And we also know that they basically got the EMI recording contract because of the music publishing that somebody at EMI was after to get the Lennon-McCartney team to write songs for their acts. That's another revelation of Tune In. Basically, how they got their foot in the door was because somebody there, I can't remember the guy's name, caught wind of the fact that on that Decca tape there were 3 originals, and he thought they were good enough that if these guys keep writing, that's going to be a very valuable asset for Parlophone. I don't care what they do beyond that. So it is the writing that got them into becoming recording artists despite themselves. But it was their live reputation that got them this fan base who presumably would buy their records. And we know from the histories we've read of the scene, there were plenty of other acts that were considered to be great dynamic acts. Among them, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, Mr. Showmanship of the circuit, that couldn't write a song to save his life. And even when they did start to make records, it just didn't translate.
Yeah. I know. And when you think about Rory Storm performing in his gold underpants from the top of a diving board, it just sounds like there's a paradigm of what entertainment is that seems so old world next to the Beatles. And it's like the Beatles are inventing a new mold or a new set of rules that are still in play. When you watch that Around the Beatles TV special, it's fascinating to look at the Beatles' performances in that TV show against all of the other support acts in and around them that just seem so dated in comparison, at least to me, at least to my eyes and ears.
You look at what was considered hip in that time that they were coming of age. Cliff Richard and the Shadows, they're the top of England, the closest quote-unquote authentic rocker they've got to Elvis and the American stuff. Yeah, he's got the Elvis looks and he's a decent enough singer. And you see the Shadows, all competent musicians, but doing those little matching dance move stuff that you then see the Hurricanes doing in the footage we have of them. And it just looks so incredibly ridiculous to modern eyes. And you've got, again, the source that keeps on giving, Lennon Remembers, where he talks about they were against bullshit movement and making fun of Mick Jagger for dancing like a fairy, whatever he says. As much as they were smitten with Elvis, and Elvis was the thing that, just by sheer power of his music, not the live act, because they never experienced that, whatever they saw on TV, how they made a conscious decision that they weren't going to ape that stuff. They weren't going to do Mick Jagger trying to be James Brown or any of that stuff, nor were they going to do the matching movements, which they had to have recognized were ridiculous. But what you do pick up on, if you're trying to deconstruct what it was that made them such an exciting act, beyond the sheer power of their voices, and to give the devil his due, the Atom beat that was making them popular by Pete Best during those years pre-recording contract. He wasn't holding them back. They were, if anything, in those live situations being propelled by that. So what are they doing? We see Lennon has got that, to the eyes of the beholder, erotic, hip-thrusting stance. You've got George in the middle. You've got Paul, cute and charming, long eyelashes guy on the other side for the symmetry. And it seemed like when you watch the early footage of them performing, whether it was a conscious decision or not, the music is all exciting and raucous, but they're like being relatively still in their movements until that climactic release of the oohs and the head shaking into the mic, and that's where the girls let loose. So it's like they may have consciously or not put a finger on that tension between the excitement of the music and the non-excitement of the visual until you have that build up to a release. And you'll listen to the recordings of their live shows well through the touring years. If you're looking at it like when I'm editing shows and look at the sound waves, I could see where the spike is. That must have been where they did a woo or something like that. Because that's where you get the big, loud reaction from the crowd. So it is interesting that they contrived their visual presentation as a reaction to what came before. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do this. And in so doing, created something new that was so much more exciting in its own way and cooler besides, because it didn't seem like you were trying, you were just doing it. It was natural.
Can I ask you, do you think that as a live act, the Beatles peaked at a certain point and then slowly started to sort of, die on the vine?
Well, sure, because if you just want to rely on the audio and filmed evidence of their tours, I would say maybe the most exciting performance we've got captured is the DC Coliseum. It's a full-blown concert. They seem every bit as excited at the reaction they're getting as the people are to see them. By the time they come back to the States in August, and in between they've done Australia, they're in another part of the world they've never been before, and it's another great dynamic performance. Beatles Sing for Shell, what we've got of that, great document. You start to see the edges a little bit being polished off. Hollywood Bowl, it's a great sounding performance. I don't think it's got quite the electricity of the DC shows. Because they're becoming more professional then. And they're being more distant from their audience. Certainly, the audience is right in their face in D.C., and those occasions will be fewer and far between from that point on. They're getting bigger and bigger venues, and I think it's clear that they recognized over time they kept doing what was before them. It made sense to do a Shea Stadium in 65 because, you know what, you could sell 55,000 tickets very easily, even though it made less musical sense.
You make a lot of money.
Yeah, for sure. And John would refer that later to Sid Bernstein as the top of the mountain. You look at the shows later on that tour, he's right in that they degraded over the rest of the tour. 66, they're phoning it in.
Yeah.
So you absolutely can make the case that they were withering on the vine as a live act. The powerhouse unit they were that got them through 62, it recedes over the next year and a half. And then at some point, it's like, well, the state of touring in 1966, it doesn't make any sense for us to do this anymore. We're artists now.
Yeah.
We're studio artists. This is what we're crafting. This is what we're doing. And you cannot reproduce it live. Nobody wants to hear it anyway. These are bloody tribal rights, as John called them. But at some point, it seems like they recognized they were getting something of value out of an audience. Now, how to control it, how to put it in a situation where we've got a handle on it, that it's not just us being fed to the lions and nobody can hear anything and it's just no good. There's the quote, the Beatles gave up touring 15 minutes too soon because like by 67, they'd kind of figured most of that stuff out. But I don't know if the audiences necessarily would have, but you then have September 68, they filmed the Hey Jude promo with a controlled audience around them, live vocal on top of the studio backing. Not a concert situation, but it was enough to plant the seed. We should do something live, but under very controlled conditions. And that leads directly to the proposed Let It Be concert. Before that, they booked the Roundhouse in December. It's a small venue. Maybe we can do something there. Of course, it doesn't come off, but I think they recognized at a certain point that there was something they were getting that was very important to them as performers from an audience that no amount of time in the studio and well-crafted records could replace. And that, I think, leads directly to September 1969, Paul proposing to John, let's go back to the clubs. And John...
Ricky and the Red Stripes, right?
Yeah, right. Not Susie.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting that the way that they think about live performance in 69 is in terms of going back in time. And you can hear it in the Nagra reels as well when they're talking about what a particular song is going to sound like when they do their live TV show or they go up on the roof. I think Paul or John make the comment that we're still thinking about it like we're in a dance hall in 1962. We need to remember that technology has moved on and we can do things live that we weren't able to do before. I mean, this all suggests to me that as a live act, they peak with the explosion of worldwide Beatlemania. And it's like the live act is then frozen in Beatlemania aspic. And it can't really escape from that. And partly in 66, 65, there are technological reasons for that you're alluding to. But I think that they themselves don't quite know how to move it forward in ways. I mean, if you look at what songs they're performing in 1966, like at Candlestick Park, they open with rock and roll music. They do She's a Woman. They're doing Babies in Black.
I feel fine.
They finish with, Long Tall Sally is their closer. It's like they're not interested in trying to push the boundaries of live performance in the way that they are either on record or just sort of aesthetically, their aspect. You see them going out on stage in psychedelic clothes and tinted sunglasses, and they sing rock and roll music. There's an incongruous quality to that. It's like watching Syd Barrett sing Rock Around the Clock at a Pink Floyd concert.
Oh, dear. Yeah, it's funny because I think that in its time, you just accepted it. It's the Beatles. They must know what they're doing. But from this distance, it looks kind of bizarre. And one of the things I always thought was a great what if had Brian not died. And he's got this great flair for presentation. He's got the lease on the Savile Theatre in London. They're putting out Pepper, Do All You Things Love. What if, instead of going out on the road, the audience came to them and they had a residency there, could augment it with all the musicians you wanted, but just did what is now the normal thing. Back then, it was complete out-of-the-box thinking. What they might have done in terms of developing a live act, because we know damn well they were paying so much attention to what was going on around them in terms of what other acts were doing. You've got Cream, you've got Hendrix, you've got all these acts that are going beyond what was the paradigm when they learned their craft and took it on the road in the throes of Beatlemania, these package tours where you do your 25-minute, half-hour set, the hits, you've got a big opener, big closer, the hits in between, and it's very compact. But it's also very by rote. And they're developing this material. I don't think it occurs to them, what about stretching out on stage? They certainly must have been doing that in Hamburg with these 2-minute rock and roll songs. They've got 6 to 8 hours to fill.
Yeah.
So why didn't it occur to them, or they just gave it up before they had a chance to really develop that? So come 1969, where we need to have upbeat songs. We need to have something fast. These are going to be rockers for the show that we're proposing to do. And unfortunately, most of what they have in their hand doesn't quite fit that criteria, but they're working on it. In their way, they're sort of groping toward being that basic live unit again after the years of developing the studio craft and capturing all the sound and using the studio as a tool. Now they want to strip it all back and be that basic band again, though obviously they've advanced considerably as songwriters. So what to do? And they end up on the roof for that. But I think in that moment where they're so buzzed by it, the wheels are turning. And I think too many other things got in the way that prevented them from enacting it and taking it further. Absent Decline, absent some of the other issues that were going on in 1969, it would be interesting to see how that might have panned out if they all had the will. We got to do something. How are we going to do it? Let's figure this out.
Yeah, I've always been intrigued by the fact that Paul makes this proposal. Let's go back and show up at, dance halls or whatever, and we'll pretend to be this other band. And John's response is to say, I think you're daft. But he's just as gung-ho for live performance. He's the one going to Toronto and playing in Cambridge. It just seems like he doesn't want to do it with the Beatles. And you could say George is in the same category, going out with Delaney and Bonnie.
Right. So it's funny, that those two are the ones that step up to live performance, even though Paul's the one that craves the most, seemingly. In George's case, he seemed comfortable not having to carry a show, being in the background. That much he got off on. John, he's happy to be in any ad hoc situation. He's not going to get locked into the same group of people playing with them all the time. So it's very fluid, whether it's David Peel and his Merry Gang or Elephant's Memory after that. It's just very spur of the moment, whatever comes. And there's something very punk about that in its way, but no less so than what Wings ended up doing, these little hit and run university tours they start doing in 72, just showing up, playing for beer money.
Yeah.
And by the time they hit the world, late 75, they do Australia, 76, they come to America, then end the year at Wembley. Wings has got such a professionally produced presentation going. It's like, where did that come from? The difference between 72 and 75, and we know he didn't play at all in 74. It's just really evolved to state of the art. They didn't have flying pigs or anything like that, but they did have lasers. They had smoke machines, and they were learning to adapt their material for live performance, stretch it out where warranted, although Paul did tend to want to stick to the arrangements of the records in a way that George didn't on the Dark Horse tour, where he was doing a lot more jamming and stuff.
And changing lyrics.
So
something in the way she moves became something in the way she moves it.
Yes. There's nothing sacred in my life. I love God more.
Yeah, that's right. It's a whole other conversation, but I'm increasingly interested in Paul's approach to live performance as a solo artist and the fact that he really builds towards Wings Over America as a peak for that particular band, as a way of saying, I can do something that's as successful as the Beatles. And then it seems to evaporate again. It seems like he's looking for an escape valve from live performance by getting himself busted for pot in Japan. And then he just does nothing for another 9 years, really.
Right.
By way of live performance. And I wonder why he went cold on it. Was it just having climbed that particular mountain again? He didn't see the need to do it for a third time?
Well, I know that Wings had those aspirations to play live, but if you listen to the shows they did at the end of 79, I don't think it compares well to the band of 76, which is, in all due respect to Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley, I don't think it's the band. There's something about it that doesn't seem to have that same sort of power and punch the band had in 76. I'm not quite sure exactly what that was. If it would have developed over time, had they toured in 80 and played out the year the way they intended. And I think Paul himself has made the case that maybe that was just his passive-aggressive way of ending Wings, because when he goes in the studio with George Martin that year, and George says, I'm not going to record these guys. I want to cast each song to whatever musicians fit what we're trying to do here. And that becomes Tug of War. I think I've read this, and I don't know if it's the primary reason, but I know Linda hated touring.
Yeah.
And once John was killed, there were legitimate concerns over safety. And I don't know if that was part of what led him to abandon the road at that juncture till 1989. In between, he dabbles in film, doing a lot of videos and stuff. So it takes him a while to climb back on that horse. And I don't know if it's because he felt he had the players to do it, or he just was missing it so badly. Or maybe he felt, I'm not in as big a physical jeopardy as I thought I might have been back in the early 80s. I don't know. But again, you've got him with this great road band that can certainly pull off this complex material live. And he clearly loved it, although Linda, like I said, apparently didn't.
Yeah, this is more unfounded and speculative. But sometimes I wonder whether there are more personal family reasons for Paul's decision not to tour, basically for the 1980s. I think it's probably no one thing, but a contributing factor might have been the effect that touring lifestyle had on young children.
Sure. His kids would have been in their teens then.
That's right. I think particularly a child that's as sensitive as Heather is purported to be, it seems to have had maybe an adverse effect on the security and stability that sensitive children need. And maybe James arriving on the scene in 1978, I think, 77 or 78.
78, yeah.
Maybe having another child that looked like they were also quite sensitive and needed a bit of a stable upbringing contributed to Paul not wanting to tour, at least while James was young.
Yeah.
I'm speculating.
Oh, sure, and they're all very valid reasons.
Yeah.
What I find more interesting is that George, who clearly liked being the sideman with Delaney and Bonnie, and then does Concert for Bangladesh where he's compelled to be the front man, although it's sort of a precursor of all-star bands where he's got everybody getting their spotlight. He produces this all-star onstage band. There were more people that could have taken the spotlight that maybe didn't. Leon got his one shot. Billy got his one shot. Eric could have done something, though apparently he was in really bad shape, and that wasn't going to happen. I always thought it curious that Badfinger didn't get a solo spot. As an Apple act he was desperately trying to promote at the time.
Yeah.
But by all accounts, they were very buzzed about what they had done and were thinking about doing more such benefits, and then he didn't. And then by the time he does get back to the road, he's in such a bad place that for as ambitious in scope is as what he wants to do, he's not in the right headspace to do it. He's very cranky, very bitter. He's going through some personal travails, some substance abuse travails, and I always thought that's the tour he should have had in 76, when he's in a much better place, with a stronger album, and the lighthearted George is back. That would have been something. But he seemed to have a great deal of ambivalence, if not outright disdain for playing live, or at least in the situation where he's carrying the show. And Clapton arm twists him into doing Japan, but that's as far as he takes it. And then he does one more show after that in England, and that's it. So he's somebody that I'd often wondered if he'd been in a better place in 74, and if he hadn't been savaged by certain critics, if the public had been more embracing of the world music, Ravi Shankar thing he's bringing to them, if it might have encouraged him to do more. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe it's a good time to sort of move from one side of our metaphorical sphere to another and think about the Beatles as recording artists. I can't remember who said it, but one of the English rock critics or journalists once said, the Beatles didn't make albums, they made records. And I'm not entirely sure what that means.
Sure.
One element of what that means might be that they, in their earlier incarnation, were more of a singles act. I mean, that seems to be where a lot of their songwriting energies went. And John said, at least at one point, that a lot of the album tracks on early albums, like with the Beatles, were failed singles.
Absolutely.
That weren't as strong as other ones. So they're really focused on the 45 market for a couple of years, don't you think?
Well, that's the currency of the times, isn't it? That's the quantifiable measure of your success, getting a hit single.
Yeah.
And albums were historically sort of an afterthought. if you were a worthy artist like a Buddy Holly or an Elvis or something like that, you might show a little more care in what populates the remainder of your album. And they were fans of that stuff as much as anyone. But I do think that it just was one more measure of certainly their talent, but also their ambition, that again, they were going to be reactive to what they saw around them, which was somewhere there's a quote from one of them. I want to say it's George, but I'm not sure, how they were disappointed in buying albums by artists they liked because they liked this single and finding the rest of the album was just glutted with junk.
Yeah.
And that they weren't going to fall into that trap.
Yeah. They do have an interesting paradigm. And I don't know enough about the standard operating procedure for pop music in the 1960s to know if the Beatles' approach to how they chose to release music was normal or whether it was unique to them. Is it the case that this idea that you release a single which is completely independent from the album you're recording simultaneously is normal for bands of this period, or is this something that is more particular to the Beatles?
It seemed to be very typical of the British bands of the day.
Okay.
And that you see any number of acts that, if you look at their albums that they issued alongside singles, more often than not, that hit single is not on the album. It's a separate animal. Yeah. In America, it was very different because it was very financially driven. The reason that Capitol tended to restrict their albums to 11 tracks had something to do with the publishing fees involved. And it was out of the question to give the full 14 tracks they were giving in Britain. And they would always fold in whatever the single was alongside it. It was very rare that they didn't do that. And plus, because they were siphoning off this extra material, 3 songs here, 3 songs there, they could pad a full album out of that and sell that in between UK releases. So it's interesting from this distance. You look at it, it's like, well, yeah, more people are going to buy the hit single. But absent a hit or familiar tune, there's less motivation to buy the album. So were they making all their money on the singles because there was so much more of them sold till people glommed onto the fact, hey, these Beatle albums are full of good material too. And certainly see other artists that are cherry picking off album tracks to record as their own singles as well. The richness of their product.
Yeah. I find it really interesting that George Martin says his greatest professional regret was not putting Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields on the Beatles' 1967 album, the one that we know eventually became Sgt. Pepper. And why would that be such a regret? Does George Martin think that it would have been a stronger album with those 2 songs on it? Because I almost want to go back in time and remind him, taking the best 2 songs that they'd recorded and releasing them as the A and B side of a single is what you had always done. Why is this suddenly a huge regret?
I always took that as sort of a tacit admission that maybe Pepper wasn't as strong as it could have been, song-wise, and you've got these 2 mighty, amazing pieces of work that would have just made it universal how strong and amazing an album Pepper is, although it mostly got that acclaim anyway. I think a lot of it just because they made an event out of it, and the presentation and everything about it just screamed, this is serious art. Maybe it was in hindsight, he's thinking, well, maybe we could have done without this song, could have done without that song. I don't know if that was in his head or not. But you're right, that singles was still what they did. And if you look at the context, that they hadn't released anything new since August of 66. And this is an eternity by this time, 6 months before they finally get around to it. There had been so much speculation that the Beatles had broken up, that they weren't going to play live anymore because they didn't do their December shows in Britain, what was going on. I think it was a powerful convincer to put out that, no, don't worry about it. The Beatles are still all in, and here's the results of it.
Yeah.
This is the signpost to what lies ahead. And it absolutely served its purpose as far as that goes, getting people acclimated to the idea, this is your new Beatles. This isn't what you're used to. Something big is coming, folks. Get ready for it.
Yeah, I know that George Martin has said one of the reasons why he has that regret about Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields is that at one point in time, presumably late 66, they were conceiving of these 2 songs as the centerpiece for a concept album about their childhood.
Right.
And that them being purloined took the stuffing or the energy out of that particular idea. It makes me want to say, what other songs about their childhood do they have floating around at that time that would have gone on this album? I can't think of any.
No, because even before Penny Lane surfaced, the song that they were working on was When I'm 64. And we know upon Paul's return with Mal Evans, he's got this whole Sgt. Pepper's concept in his head. And that's the one, that, of course, that they run with. So, yeah, George Martin may have had that thought that was where they were going with it and they went somewhere else. But I have to think that something as narrow of that would have bored them pretty quickly had they even seriously considered it.
Yeah.
Did Magical Mystery Tour as a full-blown LP come out in Australia?
Yeah, it's one of those interesting cases where a non-canonical album has sort of become canonical through sheer quality.
Did it come out in 1967 that way, or was it like Britain where they put it up?
No. I think it was like, I'm kind of guessing here, but I'm pretty sure it came out as a double EP set, just like in Britain, because a good friend of mine had a father who was really into the Beatles in real time and had original Australian editions of all of their material. And when you got to Pepper, you could see this tiny little thing sticking out of his record shelf. And it was the double EP set of Magical Mystery Tour. So I think that's what came out in Australia.
Okay. Because I know it did eventually get adapted and became part of the CD canon as well.
Yeah.
By the end of the 70s. I think it was 76 it came out in Britain as an official LP.
Yeah.
And it was one of these things that for once Capitol got it right, because it really does hang together very well as an album. It's all 67 in one place. And in a way, I would say maybe production-wise, one can make the case that it's an advance on Pepper, taken as a whole, even though a couple of songs predate Pepper. The way the whole thing hangs together and takes you on this trip, it's a great sustained listening experience that I'm not ashamed to say I like. I know it's not what the Beatles intended, but it's a lot more handy than a double EP, I suppose.
Yeah. If there was originally an intention to make a concept album about childhood, you could say that like a whiff of that survives in Pepper, in as much as they're moving forward, they're advancing their art, but they're doing it by going back in time. They're looking to arcane Victoriana to inspire a lot of what they're doing, and writing songs that are, if they're not specifically about their own childhood, that they have a childlike quality, like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, or When I'm 64, which is a product of Paul's childhood, even if it isn't about his childhood, and that they're drawing inspiration from much older things. And the interesting irony of it is that they're doing it in order to go forward. It's like somebody in America in 66 asked them about Eleanor Rigby. And the question is something like, are you trying to move forward by making songs with strings on them? And Paul says, no, violins are very old. We're going back in time. It's like that's happening.
Yeah, there's definitely a big nostalgia vibe all over that, but not necessarily the personal nostalgia, but like you say, this very old school nostalgia that I never knew if that was them purposely being inclusive to older generations, trying to get them to feel like you can be part of this too, or if it was part of circa 67, 68, you see there is a sort of nostalgia vibe going around. It is epitomized by a Tiny Tim, who has a great success during that period, doing these 1920s arcane songs that your mother should know, I guess.
Yeah.
And Harper's Bazaar, other acts like that, things like that sort of were taken 1920s style. Eventually, by the turn of the decade, going to the early 70s, it would become 50s nostalgia that came to vogue, which I think is why John's rock and roll album came out too late. If he'd done it a couple years earlier, it might have done a little better, been more in step. But you've got that Spectorous production on Ringo's Photograph that is like perfect for that American Graffiti, Happy Days, popular taste at the time. I think timing was so much of what made that stuff successful or what made other stuff not successful.
It's funny to think that in the 70s there was 50s nostalgia and things like American Graffiti or Happy Days, and that if the same thing were to happen now, if we got nostalgic for things that happened 20 years ago, we'd be nostalgic for millennial things, which seems comparatively recent, doesn't it?
Isn't that strange? Yeah, Y2K. Who's nostalgic for that?
Nobody.
Because that's like it was yesterday.
Yeah, 80s nostalgia is still a thing, but that's twice as long ago from now as the 50s was in the 70s.
It's very strange. I think time has like stretched or something. It was a lot more compact then and distant, but it's a strange phenomenon.
Yeah. Anyway, the point that I wanted to make when I raised the subject of the Beatles as a singles act or driven by the 45 market as that never really goes away. That's there right until the end of the Beatles. And at least in Paul McCartney, it continues all through the 70s. He still operates in that paradigm of big hit singles that are related to, but not directly on, albums that are recorded concurrently. And I suppose it's a way of thinking about just how dynamic and impressive the Beatles' achievement is. And it's almost like they had concurrent recording careers.
Mm-hmm.
You can think of some bands as being great singles bands and other bands as being great album bands. But the Beatles managed to do both at the same time. And it's just another reason why you shake your head in disbelief at how good they were.
Yeah, it is an absolute art to master the crafting of the hit single. A handful of artists have done it in the last half of the 20th century, this era that we speak. Not everybody could. Some people only could make great albums, but they were the ones that simultaneously, you say, they're walking this tightrope where they, to the very end, are crafting songs made for that marketplace and doing it exquisitely. At the same time, they are nurturing, developing, and pushing the album late statement as the place that if you're an artist, that's where you got to go. You got to create something. It doesn't have to be a concept as such, but it has to be something where it is a listening experience. You're taking a full advantage of that 35 minutes of groove that you got and taking people on a journey. And how many people come 1966, 67, following the Beatles' examples, start doing their own following in that wake, that up until then, albums were just collections of songs.
Yeah. I know you've written a book about Revolver, and you've spoken about how in some ways it's an underrated album in the Beatles canon. And it's not the case that the Beatles as an album act starts with Pepper. But do you think Revolver is a great collection of songs, or is it more of a cohesive statement than that?
I think if you're looking for cohesion and thematic unity, you can contrive meaning anywhere. It's in the eye of the beholder, even where it may not exist, certainly not a conscious decision by its creator. But Revolver is a collection of songs that each one follows a song in a completely different style. It sounds nothing like. So it's got that if you're looking for a thematic unity, or the evocation of death that permeates it throughout a lot of the material.
Yeah.
I don't think that was conscious. I think that was just where they were at the time. But as a collection of songs, it certainly stands up. 3 Harrison songs, Paul dabbling in social commentary, which is as rare as hen's teeth on that album, and John taking his acid experiences and turning them in a bunch of different directions, and all of them brilliant, not sounding anything like each other. From I'm Only Sleeping to She Said, to Tomorrow Never Knows. It's just amazing. And not to use his experiences as advocation for LSD use, but he certainly channeled it in a direction that we all benefit from.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's interesting that, one of the things that TAPE, the 442 meeting, has revealed that hasn't really been talked about, maybe because other people don't find it as interesting as I do, that they're still thinking in terms of albums and singles as being quite separate from each other.
Yeah.
John proposes this idea of a 4-4-4-2 split on album space as the only appropriately democratic way forward. And then he raises the idea of a Christmas single as this totally separate idea.
Right. Yeah, which is so weird to think about what's going on in late 1969. You got Led Zeppelin happening and Black Sabbath on the horizon, and Altamont and Rolling Stones have mastered the new paradigm of live performance and all this stuff going on. It's a little retrograde, isn't it, the way he's thinking, which is so weird compared to his being so outside the box in his outside the Beatle activities. But that's how he looks at the Beatles, is this is the box we're in. This is what people expect from us. So here's a way that we can deliver it. What do you think, guys?
Yeah, that's right.
And he has on the table his desire to put out You Know My Name and Mary Jane as a single under the Plastic Ono band name in the fall of 69. And Paul's like, no, you're not.
Yeah, I wonder whether that suggests not like a creative emptiness to John Lennon, but does it speak to the fact that he doesn't have a lot of songs kicking around in 1969 that he's looking to put that stuff out?
I think it's hard to know exactly what was in his head. And when you look at what was in his head, like spending studio time on laughing, things like that that ended up going nowhere. He's clearly in sway to the encouragement Yoko is giving him to think of music in an entirely different way.
Sure.
But he's not so uncanny as to think, well, I've got these two perfectly good musical songs laying here, one more than the other. I don't know. It floors me to this day that there was actually a demo to What's the New Mary Jane.
Yeah.
It sounds like it took longer to perform than it did to write. Nonetheless, when you consider even going to the Twickenham stuff, that they had all kinds of songs laying around that they seemed to pick up and then put down if they couldn't find an immediate use for it. Child's Nature gets resurrected. Ultimately, of course, it would end up coming out as Jealous Guy. He recognizes he's got a good tune there. Somehow, the lyric must fall short in his head because he's never able to push it hard. Across the Universe, another song that, completely dissatisfied with the February 68 recording, takes it up at Twickenham for lack of other material, doesn't really go anywhere. There's other things that you see, at least in part, are in existence far earlier on than you would ever see them in released form.
Yeah.
Give Me Some Truth, another Twickenham song that Paul helps him with, by the way.
Yeah, I know. I've often thought of that when I see the ongoing controversy around the Lennon-McCartney writing credit. And, when Paul bangs on about wanting to have it reversed on specific songs. And the response from the Lennon estate always seems to be no. I can kind of get where Paul's coming from. And, he gives the example of looking at Spotify or iTunes and seeing Yesterday by John Lennon and P. ... It must be frustrating.
Sure.
But he doesn't look good when he bangs on about this too much, don't you think? Like,
it's a thankless position.
It makes him look a bit petty.
Yeah. There's no way to look good.
Yeah.
But in all fairness, if no one else is going to do the advocating for him and you're left to do it on your own, you could see that, especially when he explains it like that. Well, there are people growing up listening to this music that aren't going to know that I had anything to do with it because my name is cut off. But then you get the gratuitous slaps from Yoko. Well, John was the Mozart to your Scaglieri. It's like, really?
Yeah.
The hell is that about?
Yeah, no, I don't buy that.
I don't think anybody did.
But yeah, it's interesting that when Paul talks about wanting to have Lennon-McCartney reversed on specific songs, it opens up a can of worms about authorship that could include things like Give Me Some Truth, because there's audio evidence of Paul contributing to the writing of that song, and his name doesn't appear anywhere on it.
Oh, sure, yeah. And that's something that is definitely a slippery slope.
Yellow Belly, son of Gary Cooper, gonna...
Yeah. On me.
Selling me dope. Gotta hope. It's just money for rope. Down Yellow Belly, son of Gary Cooper, never selling me dope.
Any other guitars of mine?
Money for rope.
What have I got?
Freaked out, it was started in D, didn't it? Yours was in E, wasn't it? Oh.
What I thought was funny about the whole reverse credit thing is he did it in John's lifetime on Wings Over America.
Yeah.
And nobody raised a peep about it.
Yeah, and I can't remember exactly what release this was on, but there was at least one posthumous Lennon release that included Give Peace a Chance, and the Lennon-McCartney credit was removed, and it was just by John Lennon.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think Paul kicked up a fuss about that.
Right. I think it's sort of a case-by-case basis, and if somebody brought it up to him, I'm sure he'd say, well, John can have that one.
Yeah.
I really had nothing to do with it, and The story is it was a thank you for helping him with Ballad of John and Yoko, so who the hell knows?
Yeah, and when Yoko ended up being given a writing credit on Imagine, my mischievous thought was, I wonder if she's going to want to take credit for How Do You Sleep, because we've seen film footage of her working on the lyrics for that.
Oh, yes. Right. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I don't know if you ever heard the conversation I had with Ray Connolly about that one.
No, I don't. Remind me.
Basically, his point was inspiration is not collaboration.
Yeah, that's right. I feel like I've seen the original lyric sheet for Imagine, and I don't know, I wasn't there. Maybe Yoko was throwing out lines that ended up in the song, but I know that the idea for Imagine grew out of the Grapefruit book and some of the instructions in there. But that lyric sheet is all in John's hand.
Yeah. And if you were going to start crediting people that inspired you to do this, that, or the other, come together would be Lennon, McCartney, Barry, things like that. It's like, where do you want to stop? I'm down, Lennon, McCartney, Penniman.
Yeah.
You can go on and on.
Yeah, that's right. And then you can say, well, Harrison is a name that deserves to be on a lot of these songs, like And I Love Her. Didn't you say, Paul, that Da 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 is that song? So why is his name not anywhere on this credit?
Yeah. You can make the case, I Me Mine being a Harrison McCartney song.
Yeah, that's very true. I suppose this is a nice way to talk about what I was conceiving of as the fourth element to this square. So you have the Beatles as a live act, the Beatles as a singles act, the Beatles as an album act, but you also have Lennon-McCartney as this distinct entity at the very heart of what the Beatles are. Mm-hmm. I think John would say at some point, Paul and me were the Beatles, which I don't think is true.
No, to his dying day he said that.
Anybody that thinks that if John and Paul got together with George and Ringo, the Beatles would exist out of their skull. The Beatles exist as they ever did on the records. So why people keep asking for the Beatles, I don't know. The Beatles gave everything they got to give and more, and it exists on record. There's no need for the Beatles for what people think of the Beatles, of the four guys that used to be that group, that can never ever be that group again, even if they wanted to be, trying to do it again. And to say that it would be an interesting musical experiment is just intellectual garbage. You mean if Paul McCartney and John Lennon got together, would they produce some good songs? Maybe, maybe not. But whether George and Ringo joined in or not is irrelevant, because Paul and I created the music. Okay? I don't have a problem about the Beatles. I don't have a problem about Paul, George, and Ringo. It's fine, but it was then. And they're old school friends, that I went to college with them, but I was never one for reunions. I never went back to my old grammar school or my old art school. I'm one of those people, I don't see, heart don't grieve. It's all over.
Yeah, that's right. But tell me what you think of this idea. In a lot of early interviews with the Beatles, Paul stresses the fact that he and John have songwriting ambitions that exist kind of independent from the success of the Beatles. He says, we've thought about it, and probably the thing that John and I will do will be to write songs, as we have been doing as a sort of sideline now. We'll probably develop that a bit more.
Right.
Even in 1966, when they're interviewed in Washington, D.C., there's a press conference there, and they're asked about the breakup of the band, Paul gives an amazing response to the question, are the Beatles going to break up? He says, we've realized the possibility of breaking up as a sort of natural progression, because we can't go on forever like this. So we've got to think now and prepare for it if it did happen, which it should, It's got to sometime. We think about it now so that we're not at a loss when it does happen. Mm-hmm. I suspect that when he says phrases like prepare for it, so we're not at a loss, I think he's alluding to the fact that he and John have this idea in the back of their minds that when the Beatle bubble bursts, Lennon and McCartney will still mature into a new phase of songwriting partnership for other artists, perhaps.
Yeah. That's especially true very early on when they're asked about that. And it's interesting to see as late as 1966 that they're still thinking in those terms, because what was the precedent to that point? I'd like to know, because I don't remember off the top of my head, when was it first voiced? At what point? Because as you pointed out at the onset, They did this dabbling in songwriting when they were teenagers, then became this great performing act. And then only when they're under contract to EMI and Brian sends a telegram going back to the whole serious songwriting thing, which they don't let up on again through the duration of the Beatles' career or even after that. So when did they first say, we want to be the Goffin and King of England?
Yeah, it must have something to do with the setting up of Northern Songs and Maclen Music as two separate music companies that they're shareholders in. That must be part of it. But I don't really know.
But it's a great tipping of the hand that we want to be the writer of standards, if only just in rock and roll. We want to write material that other people will cover and enrich themselves. It seems like that ambition, at least for them as Lennon-McCartney, has played out by 66. The only one that's really seriously writing for other people still is Paul. And he would do that for the duration of the Beatles' years. Woman comes out in 66, which John has nothing to do with. When's the last time John wrote a song specifically for somebody else?
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to think. Maybe 64.
Yeah, it was pretty early on, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But he initiates it in a way, doesn't he? Isn't he writing for PJ Proby and other people before Paul has given a song to anyone else?
Yeah, I think that once he recognized that this was a lucrative revenue stream, it's like, oh, sure. As you said about I Want to Be Your Man, we weren't going to give them anything good, right? So it's surplus material that is unfit. There's one thing to put album tracks on that weren't fit to be singles. These are songs that aren't unfit to be album tracks.
Yeah, I suspect that what was at one time a background long game of songwriting for Lennon and McCartney that they anticipated would have a life longer than the Beatles' success. Yeah, it does seem to have faded away in around 66, and you can maybe tie it to something like the Family Way soundtrack. There is an interview where John in early 66 talks about the fact that he and Paul are going to write the score for a film. And this must be the Family Way. And yet it ends up being a solo Paul McCartney project. So maybe the ambition for Lennon and McCartney outside the Beatles can be wrapped up in what happened with that film soundtrack and why it ended up being a solo Paul thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure if by that early in 66 that would have been the one, or if they had something else in mind that didn't come to anything.
Maybe not.
Just as they had these other film scripts for their third film come and go. Some films were eventually made, but repurposed without the Beatles, like A Talent for Loving. I don't know what John was speaking of, but then he points out in the Maureen Cleave interview, that's why I do these other things. I paint and I write and do these things outside the Beatles. Whatever it is I should be doing, I know this isn't it. And then he dabbles in filmmaking. He gets the offer from Dick Lester to be in How I Won the War, decides acting is not for him because it's too delayed gratification.
Yeah.
And all he got out of that was writing Strawberry Fields. But as you had alluded to earlier, that in the 70s, that period where he's still trying to figure himself out, he starts writing these songs with the intent to put together a musical.
The Ballad of John and Yoko, right?
Yeah. You know, these songs that end up being nothing, but he's thinking in those terms, that is a valid artistic goal for a rock and roller, which is interesting to me. You've got currently Paul writing the musical of It's a Wonderful Life. But I always thought it was kind of an uneasy thing. It's one thing to write a rock opera, to write a Tommy that's still at least based in rock, but turning it into a show, as Tommy became, it's a wholly different animal. I can't even think of what musicals there might have been that they might have been comfortable with as far as templates go. Wasn't there one, God, what was it called? Jerry Lee Lewis was in it, and I think it was a retelling of Othello. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh,
I want to say around 1968, produced by Jack Good, who had been the TV producer for Shindig and around the Beatles before that.
Catch My Soul. I'm just looking it up now.
Yes, that's it. You got
Catch
it.
My
Okay.
Soul. No, I've never seen it.
Yeah, me either. I'm just thinking if Jerry Lee Lewis was cast in it, then it's not high opera. So it must have been something at least nominally rock-based. Is that the direction they maybe were thinking of as possible for them as Lennon McCartney, Beatles songwriters? Can we do something along those lines?
Yeah.
Some kind of narrative.
Quite possibly.
Yeah.
Yes, and they certainly see cover versions of a lot of their more popular songs being something that shores up their, or legitimizes their art in some ways more than the Beatles records do.
Yeah, I guess if you get serious artists recording your stuff, that's, what kind of better validation you have. 64, you've got Ella Fitzgerald doing Can't Buy Me Love. By 65, you got Duke Ellington recording Beatle material. Eventually, Sinatra.
Yeah.
I want to say Tony Bennett beat him to it as far as that sort of crooner class of those pre-Beatles pop singers. So Sinatra eventually gets around to it. Elvis is even covering Beatles by the end.
That's right. Sergio Mendes in Brazil 66 do Day Tripper, I think.
Yes, yeah. And Fool on the Hill.
Yeah. There's a really interesting, it's another 66 interview where John is being asked about their songwriting ambitions. And he's trying to pay John a compliment by saying, this is not just a flash in the pan pop thing. You guys, Lennon and McCartney, are truly great songwriters. And he keeps giving the examples of Michelle and Eleanor Rigby. And I could just kind of hear in John's silence this seething jealousy that neither of these examples are his songs.
That's hilarious. They left out Yesterday?
Didn't John say when he wrote Imagine, like he was really excited about it and said to Yoko, finally I wrote a song as good as Yesterday?
I've heard that, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think it's quite the evergreen he thought it was. I mean, certainly it's been covered a bunch, but not quite on the same level. It's a very different animal besides. When you think of in terms of validation, and maybe you brought this up before, by end of 65, an entire TV special is built around the music of Lennon and McCartney.
Yeah.
What an astonishing thing for a rock and roll act to have happen. You want to talk about establishment validation, and you look at who's in there. It's an array of artists, some within their tribe. You've got your Cilla Black and Marianne Faithfull, but then you've got Henry Mancini. What an amazing thing. And he does a brilliant job on If I Fell.
Yeah, that's right. Another thing that in the really early days that's probably driving songwriting ambition for Lennon and McCartney as a distinct thing from the Beatles is the fact that sheet music is still quite a lucrative thing to be in. I mean, that's a lot of what drives music publishing in, say, 1962, 1963. But it's another example of something that seems so old world now.
Right. Yeah. And they're highly collectible now, of course, if you can find those with the Beatle artwork on all these Lennon McCartney songs and George songs as well. Yeah, it's definitely something that certainly Dick James would have been pushing. He wants to get as many people to record those songs as possible because guess what? He gets to be a millionaire before they do. And as noted, John lost the interest in writing for other people pretty early on. And I don't know if it was because he was so, by 65, 66, only interested in writing what was directly applicable to himself, that had meaning for him. And that's going to narrow the scope if you're not writing generic love songs at that point. Whereas Paul had no problem with that because that stuff comes as naturally as breathing to him, to crank out a woman or a step inside love or a goodbye or a come and get it. It just comes out of him. He's just a natural facilitator with music. And John can't quite see through those eyes of somebody else's perspective wanting to record something that he wrote. He's not interested in that anymore.
Yeah.
So
I wonder whether it's partly that John has this explosion of creativity, 64, 65. He's dominating those Beatles albums and he's giving songs to other people in at least 64. But it seems to be something that gets harder for him to do in 66. There's more effort involved in writing songs. And so if he's going to make that effort, it's going to be for the priority of a Beatles album rather than for anything else. Whereas Paul still seems to be able to churn them out at will.
Right. And that ties to the 444-2 discussion that it said outside of that meeting in other interview situations around that time, I'm not going to spend 6 months of my life working on an album and just get X amount of tunes on it. You know, it's like he recognizes the slogging nature of crafting a Beatles album by that time. I don't think Abbey Road was terribly drawn out. It's certainly not compared to the White Album.
No.
They did a few sessions pretty early on in the spring and then wrapped it up in the month of July and August fairly quickly. Ultimately, less than 2 months work tops to create that.
Yeah. It's not a big chunk out of John's 1969. He's doing a lot of other things.
Yeah, absolutely. But in his head, that's the way he saw it, is me taking time away from what I want to do to work on somebody else's behalf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I said this to Diana Erickson in an episode of One Sweet Dream, that when you listen to John talk in that 442 meeting about songwriting as a competitive thing, he sounds exhausted and he says, I can't do it anymore. And it makes me think of George Martin saying that, this was a really healthy, creative rivalry. And that might be true if you're measuring health by the quality of the product. But if you're talking about the mental health toll that it might have taken on John Lennon, he sounds like he's someone who just is unwilling or unable to compete with Paul McCartney at doing this for much longer.
Yeah, can you imagine how daunting that must have been when every time you turn around, Paul's got another 6 songs to lay on you? Yeah. It's like, stop, And George, by 69, is rising in his own capacity for cranking this stuff out, but a lot of it is deeply personal, maybe as personal in its own way as John's was, but maybe less universal or at least adaptable to the Beatle paradigm, especially when it starts bringing God into it. There was no way in hell the Beatles were going to record a Hear Me Lord that he brings in Twickenham in January 69. So, that had to be a tough thing for them to face, is being in a band with a guy that not only is way more prolific than you'll ever be, but also increasingly the auteur in terms of his facility on other instruments and his way of saying, well, this is what you're going to do on this song that I brought in. And that absolutely must have driven them nuts, because they start out as this egalitarian organization. And we know bit by bit we're learning so much more about what George and Ringo even contributed to the final product that they were never given credit for. But when you're faced with a situation where one composer in the band is giving you less and less space to do your thing, what are you supposed to do with that?
Yeah, that's right. And it kind of circling back to where we began this conversation with the idea of leadership within the Beatles. And you said at the outset that Paul McCartney kind of is steering this particular ship from at least 67 onwards. And sometimes when people are critical of that, he's stealing leadership away, there's the implication or the belief that this leadership rightfully belongs to John Lennon and Paul has stolen it. I don't think of it in those terms. I see it more in terms of ebb and flow. John may have driven the energy of the band through 63 and 64 more than Paul, perhaps. And yes, Paul has got more A-sides in, 68, 69, 67, and is coming up with the ideas for project and is motivating the band to get to work. But that's okay. I mean, as in any relationship, there are ebbs and flows. And sometimes one is the leader, sometimes the other is the leader. And I think it's wrong to think about leadership as something that Paul stole. Don't you think?
Right. Because it presupposes it was yours by rights in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But what do you make of the fact that it was of such importance to John to have the title of the one who ended the Beatles? I started the band and I ended it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, that's a big can of worms. I've thought a great deal about the Beatles breakup. It seems to be the thing that I've spoken most about in public fora. But I genuinely don't think that there is a single individual that you can pin the breakup on. I don't think that the Beatles are done when John says, I want a divorce.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you only need to think about how divorces play out in more conventional terms to know that that's the start of a conversation. It's not the end of one.
Right.
In some ways, I think Paul might be more responsible than he's willing to admit, especially these days.
Mm-hmm.
He likes to put it on John and say, John's the one who asked for a divorce. John's the one who ended the Beatles. It wasn't me when I released that self-interview.
Right. But he's the one that showed them what a divorce looks like.
Yeah, exactly. I think that he probably knew what he was doing to some extent by putting these questions in there about the future of the band or the future of Lennon-McCartney as a songwriting partnership. I don't know that he intended it to be quite as big as Paul quits Beatles.
No, because he never does say that. He's very open-ended. He's just, I don't see it. I don't see it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean, no, he's not black and white at all about it. And, John would have been in a similar situation because that's how he tended to make pronouncements, even if he reneged on it the next day, which he was wont to do.
Yeah, I'm trying to answer your question properly. I'm going to defer to the finer knowledge and analytical powers of Phoebe and Diana from their breakup series and say that this is kind of like a high-stakes game that spiraled unintentionally out of control. That's their analogy for it, I think, is the best one that I know of.
Yeah, I think so, because that dovetails what Michael Gilmore said in his Rolling Stone piece 10 years ago, that it was an attempt at a correction in the band dynamic that led to unintended consequences. I don't think John meant for things to play out the way they did. He was simply trying to redress what he saw as an imbalance of power. And it led to a series of things that were not what he had expected nor wanted. And I do think that he came to regret it.
Yeah, that's right. It's another thing that Phoebe and Diana have pointed to, but I've long thought that this quote is particularly interesting. It's that time where, I can't remember where it is, but John is talking about a Japanese monk who falls in love with a temple and loves the temple so much that he decides to burn it to the ground so he never has to watch it slowly deteriorate, and then says, that's what I did with the Beatles. Maybe there's some truth to that. And if it's true, it's there in some of his actions through 69, like almost willing Paul to turn around and leave the band by doing things as provocatively as he can, like bringing Yoko into the band, which I see as partly him wanting the woman he loves to be with him all the time, but also as a bit of a provocation in a situation that he's dissatisfied with. But also the avant-garde happenings and other things that he and Yoko are doing in 69. There's something quite attention-seeking about them. And I think the attention that he's trying to get, even if it's at a semi-conscious level, is Paul McCartney's attention.
Sure, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that he had expected some kind of reaction from Paul that he didn't get. And that's what led to this ambiguity of the breakup until Paul, with decisive action, said, I'm going to put this limping dog of a story out of its misery, as he says in August, and then puts his lawsuit on the table by year's end. And you've got, I can't remember if it was George or John, but there was a quote from, I want to say early 73, where one of them says something to the effect of, now with Klein out of the way, we can get Paul back.
Yeah, I've heard that one too.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then there's that story about, I think it was Klein's idea for like a ruse to lure Paul back would be just to phone him and say, we're all going to be in the studio. And they attempted to do this and Paul didn't show up. And I think that the session was for early 1970.
Yeah. We're going to record this song that's got a verse about you in it.
Yeah, as if Paul's going to show up for that.
Yeah.
But in a way, like, if this is a trap to try and then say in legal terms, Paul's still invested in the band, it's an odd one, because there would have had to have been some legitimacy to this recording session for the trap to work in the first place. It's not like Paul would have arrived and then they would have admitted, we've actually got nothing. We just wanted to see if you'd show up.
Yeah. I've often thought, when thinking about Lewison's quote about John was the leader of the Beatles even when he wasn't leading, what could that mean? And one explanation that I never asked him about, and it's just kind of in my own head, is, do you mean the same way you may have a family member that is dysfunctional, that's going to impact everything, the way the family reacts and tiptoes around it? They're not leading the family everywhere, but your every action is predicated on, what can I do to avoid triggering this?
Yeah.
And you hear Paul explicitly say this out loud in that conversation at Twickenham after George quits, before John shows up, and they're addressing the John and Yoko problem. And it's where he's saying, on the one hand, if we tell him just leave the girl at home, then John's going to make his choice and leave the Beatles. I'm done. But on the other hand, isn't it going to be comic, or whatever he expresses it, 50 years from now, where people are saying the Beatles broke up because Yoko sat on an amp?
Yeah, I do agree that the analogy with a temperamental family member who everyone tiptoes around is a good one for that. I don't know whether I'd call it leadership, but it's certainly...
No, but it's impacting your actions.
Yeah, that's
so in
definitely
effect,
true. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, I wonder, because if that's what Lewison meant, then, well, you certainly got that, John. Yeah, you're not directing the artistic direction, but you are certainly controlling our behavior going forward as a band.
Yeah, I think that's also a contributing factor to how and why they broke up. I think that John behaving in this temperamental way kind of made him a bit of an errant child And it kind of casts Paul as the responsible parent who has to smooth over John's tantrums a lot of the time. And I think maybe Paul just had enough of having to do that.
Yeah.
And I kind of
I've got a baby now. I've got a new wife.
Yeah, that's
I've
right.
got another daughter.
I have to be a real parent. I can't parent you as well.
Right.
And I see it in the confrontation with Ringo when he delivers that "from us to you" note. And Paul flies completely off the handle at the least responsible guy, the guy who's the nicest member of the Beatles. That it's redirected anger, I think, at some of John's tantrums. And the reason why he gets so pissed off at the idea of having to move the release date of his own album is this recognition. Why does John get to dictate whenever his music comes out? His Instant Karma has to be released as soon as possible. I want it written for breakfast. I want to record it for lunch and release it for dinner. But when Paul says, okay, I want my album out, that's impossible. We have to, check calendars and release dates, and we'll find an appropriate time. So there's this double standard at play about who gets to do what and under what circumstances. And Paul's overreaction about other Beatles moving his release date, I think, is directly related to that. John getting whatever he wants, but Paul having to compromise.
Oh, sure. And another way he might have looked at it in the moment is Klein's signature isn't on here, but his fingerprints are all over it.
Yeah, that's right.
Like they already had made a decision. So here's your release date, June 4th or whatever it was. Oh, and by the way, there's a great Capitol Records convention going on in Hawaii. You'll love it. So it's like, who the hell do you think you are? And unfortunately, Ringo's in front of him at that moment.
Yeah, and Paul threatens to finish the nose.
Much to his dismay.
Oh, dear.
Well, that's a great endpoint, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it brought us neatly full circle.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by The Corgis.